天早些时候，在华尔街电视，我们为大家播放的节目中就讲到了中国经济的新大动脉，这是什么呢？超高压电线到底是什么？为什么能够对于中国未来的整个能源全国布局起到可能改头换面的作用？1年5000亿的投资是不是盲目上马基建，可能会造成更大的浪费？之前我们提到了三峡集团在很多国家部署新能源项目，引起了美国方面的警惕。在南美重要的国家秘鲁的大型电力项目，其实背后也有三峡集团的身影，这到底是怎么回事？秘鲁最大的港口与中国又是怎样的关系？为什么会引起美国方面的担忧？秘鲁在中国和美国之间又如何选择？这是今天我们在华尔街 AI 为大家介绍的内容。秘鲁到底是一个怎样的国家？稍后在华尔街联报，我们针对过去几天中国经济形势和股市的变化，为大家进行了集中的总结。而同时，沙利文的演讲实录，我们也会在今天节目结束之后为大家完整的展示。以上就是本期华尔街论坛的全部内容，感谢大家观看我们的节目。现在春节临近，特别要提醒各位观众朋友们在出行的时候要注意健康，注意气温，特别是现在流行性感冒仍然是十分的严重希望大家能够身体健康。谢谢麦团，谢谢云水，谢谢魔里西斯给我们观众朋友们给我们节目的打赏。明天同一时间我们再会。
大家好，您现在收看的是来自六度世界的六度百科，这是一个 AI 驱动的新型媒体，网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。网址是六度 World。 节目的内容是秘鲁会迅速崛起，全面探讨其社经发展与未来挑战。
秘鲁会迅速崛起。
为了更好地分析和讨论秘鲁这个问题，我将会从多个角度和层次进行解读，并撰写一份百科知识文章。本文将分为以下5个章节： 1. 秘鲁的基本概况； 2. 秘鲁的经济状况； 3. 秘鲁的社会状态； 4. 秘鲁的国际影响力；以及 5. 秘鲁的挑战和前景。秘鲁的基本概况。秘鲁，全名秘鲁共和国，是位于南美洲西部的一个国家，其自然景观丰富多变，除了有安第斯山脉、亚马逊雨林，还拥有太平洋海岸线。首都利马是该国最大的城市，也是南美洲最大的城市之一。秘鲁的经济状况。秘鲁是世界上最大的银矿产区以及重要的黄金、铜、锌和铅矿产区。这个以出口矿产资源为主的国家，在过去几十年间经济增长迅猛，人均收入也有所提高。然而，这种重度依赖能源的经济结构一直以来都使得秘鲁的经济易受到国际市场价格波动的影响。秘鲁的社会状态。秘鲁一直以来都存在着显著的贫富差距，同时这个国家的教育和卫生水平一直处于提升中。社会问题如毒品贩运、贫困和污染等问题也一直困扰着该国的发展。秘鲁的国际影响力。秘鲁在国际社会上拥有一定的影响力，它是联合国的创始成员国，也是世界贸易组织和太平洋联盟的成员国。此外，近年来秘鲁也试图透过外交手段来提升其影响力，并试图在国际舞台上扮演更重要的角色。秘鲁的挑战和前景。尽管秘鲁在许多方面都有显著的进步，但是该国面临着很多挑战，包括日益严重的贫富差距、环境问题、治安问题以及政治不稳定等。在未来，秘鲁是否能继续发展并突破这些问题，将是决定其是否能迅速崛起的关键。这份报告并不能完全回答秘鲁是否会迅速崛起的问题，但它提供了一种理解和评价秘鲁从多个角度来观察其潜力与挑战的框架。最终关键的答案还需要依据该国未来的政策方向和国际情势变化来确定。
秘鲁是否会迅速崛起，取决于多种因素，包括经济、政治、社会和国际环境等。以下是一些可能影响秘鲁崛起的关键因素。经济发展。秘鲁的经济增长和稳定性是其崛起的关键。秘鲁拥有丰富的自然资源，包括矿产、渔业和农业，这些都是经济增长的潜在动力。然而，经济多样化和减少对单一出口产品的依赖也很重要。政治稳定。 政治稳定性对于吸引外国投资和促进经济增长至关重要。政治不稳定，政策不连贯或腐败可能阻碍发展。社会发展、教育、卫生和社会福利的改善可以提高人民的生活水平，促进经济增长。社会不平等和贫困是秘鲁需要解决的重要问题。国际关系，秘鲁与其他国家，特别是主要贸易伙伴和区域邻国的关系，将影响其在全球舞台上的地位。内部挑战，秘鲁面临着包括基础设施不足、教育和卫生服务不平等，以及地区不平衡发展等内部挑战。全球经济环境，全球市场的变化、国际商品价格以及全球经济环境的波动都可能影响秘鲁的经济表现。综上所述，秘鲁是否能迅速崛起是一个复杂的问题，需要综合考虑多种内外部因素。同时，任何国家的快速发展都需要时间，不可能一蹴而就。秘鲁的条件与局限。
秘鲁作为一个拥有深厚历史文化和丰富自然资源的国家，具有独特的优势，但也面临着不少局限和挑战。进一步剖析如下：独特的优势，丰富的自然资源。秘鲁拥有丰富的自然资源，包括铜、银、金等重要的矿产资源，以及钓鱼和农业资源。地理位置，秘鲁位于南美洲的太平洋沿岸，与北美和亚洲的贸易路线连接便利，地理位置优越。文化遗产，秘鲁是前殖民时间的印加帝国的发源地，拥有丰富的历史和文化遗产，这对于旅游业等服务业的发展拥有积极的推动作用。局限和挑战，经济结构单一，秘鲁的经济过于依赖资源出口，特别是矿产资源，而这使得经济容易受到国际市场价格波动的影响。这种经济结构的单一性限制了秘鲁的经济发展，也可能增加其经济的风险。弱化的基础建设，在乡村地区，基础设施如交通、卫生和教育仍需改善。缺乏足够的基础设施限制了秘鲁从城市到农村的整体发展。社会问题，秘鲁仍存在重大的社会问题，特别是高度的贫富差距和高犯罪率。这些问题可能会累积社会张力，并对经济和政治稳定造成负面影响。政治不稳定，过去的政治不稳定事件和现存的腐败问题阻碍了秘鲁的长期发展和外来投资。如果不能有效解决这些问题，可能会导致社会矛盾爆发，影响国家的稳定和发展。综合上述，秘鲁的崛起将在其独特优势和局限挑战之间寻找平衡。进一步推动经济多元化，改善基础设施，解决社会问题和提高政治稳定性将成为秘鲁的主要任务。
秘鲁的主要产业，著名企业。
秘鲁的经济主要由以下产业主导。矿业，秘鲁是全球第2大铜矿生产国，拥有丰富的金、银、铜、锌和铅矿产区。其中，世界最大的金矿之一的亚马逊金矿就位于秘鲁。农业，秘鲁也是棉花、水果和坚果的重要生产国。秘鲁的棉花生产商已经成为全球最大的棉花永续发展程序的一部分。渔业，秘鲁的渔业也极为发达，得益于其丰富的海洋资源和长达2000公里的海岸线。旅游业，秘鲁拥有许多知名的世界遗产，例如马丘比丘等，在全球旅游业中占有重要地位。著名的秘鲁企业有亚马逊金矿公司 Yanacocha， 这是秘鲁最大的金矿公司，也是全球最大的金矿之一。秘鲁电信 Telefónica del Perú， 这是秘鲁最大的电信公司，提供固定线、宽带和移动通信服务。秘鲁国家航空 Aeroperu， 这是秘鲁的国家航空公司，提供国内和国际的航空服务。银行信贷与商业 Banco de Crédito del Perú， 这是秘鲁最大的银行，提供各种金融服务。那新蒙卢比亚超市链 Supermercados Peruanos， 这是秘鲁最大的超市链之一，遍布全国各地。南部铜业 Southern Copper Corporation， 这是一家在秘鲁和墨西哥拥有矿产权的大型铜矿公司。以上的产业和企业都代表了秘鲁在不同经济领域的主导地位。
秘鲁自身的各种问题。
秘鲁作为一个发展中国家，固然有着许多的优势和机遇， 但同时也面对着许多难以解决的问题和挑战。经济结构单一，秘鲁经济过于依赖自然资源，尤其是矿产资源的出口。这种单一结构使得秘鲁的经济成长很大程度上取决于国际市场情况，对国际经济波动的抵抗力较弱。贫富差距严重，虽然秘鲁在过去几十年中经济有所增长，但是贫富差距问题仍然相当严重，这也导致许多社会问题，如犯罪率高、教育和医疗资源短缺等。基础设施不足，尤其是在乡村地区，交通、教育、医疗和卫生等基础设施建设相对落后，这限制了秘鲁的全面发展。政治不稳定和腐败，在过去的一段时间内，秘鲁出现了一系列的政治不稳定事件，包括政府腐败问题，这些都对秘鲁的经济发展和社会稳定造成了很大的影响。环境问题，虽然秘鲁的自然资源丰富，但是好像任何其他资源丰富的国家一样，环境污染和生态破坏的问题相当严重。例如，过度开采导致的土地劣化、资源抢夺导致的社区矛盾等。解决上述问题需要秘鲁政府和社会各界共同努力，透过经济转型、深化改革以及进一步开放，打破现状，实现更加平衡和可持续的发展。
秘鲁与中国的合作与麻烦。
秘鲁和中国有着深厚的经济关系，合作范畴包括自由贸易、投资以及基础设施建设等领域。合作，秘鲁是拉丁美洲首批与中国签订自由贸易协定的国家之一，该协定在2016年被世界贸易组织评为全球最佳贸易协定之一。通过这种方式，秘鲁和中国已经成功地加深了双边贸易和投资关系。此外，中国作为秘鲁的主要投资者和贸易伙伴，在基础设施、矿业、能源等领域的投资促进了秘鲁的经济发展。例如，中国企业在秘鲁的矿业项目投资尤为突出，并且考虑到秘鲁的有利矿产资源，这种合作关系预计在未来将会继续加强。麻烦。然而，秘鲁与中国的合作同时也面临着一些困难和挑战。首先，虽然秘鲁与中国的贸易量在不断增长，但是秘鲁与中国的贸易大多基于原材料的出口，这使秘鲁的经济与中国的需求密切相关，而且对国际市场价格波动的抵抗能力较弱。其次，在环保问题上，中国公司在秘鲁的矿产开发对环境和当地社区造成了一些负面影响，包括污染、生态破坏和社区矛盾等，这引起了秘鲁公众对中国投资的关注与抵制。最后，就政治问题而言，中国在秘鲁的投资和影响力也引起了美国等国的警惕，导致秘鲁在国际关系中被置于一种空前紧张的状态，对秘鲁的国际地位和外交政策都产生了重大影响。因此，秘鲁需要在中国提供的经济机会与合作可能带来的问题之间找到一种平衡，以确保其长期利益和发展可持续性。
秘鲁受美国影响多大？会破坏秘鲁与中国合作？
美国对秘鲁的影响主要体现在以下几方面。经济贸易，秘鲁是美国在拉丁美洲的主要贸易伙伴之一，他们的贸易关系尤其在签订美国秘鲁贸易促进协定后得到了进一步深化。此外，作为亚太经济合作组织 APEC 的成员国，秘鲁和美国还在更大的区域经济框架下互动。援助与合作，美国通过其国际援助署 USAID 向秘鲁提供多方面的援助和支持，包括改善公共服务、加强治理、抵制腐败等，这对促进秘鲁的社会经济发展产生了积极影响。政治影响，美国在秘鲁的政治影响主要体现在推动民主化、保护人权和反对腐败等领域，这些对秘鲁的政治发展产生了重要影响。正如之前的资讯提到的，秘鲁并未受到美国的贸易压力影响其与中国的合作。实际上，特别是在矿业领域，中国的投资产生了显著的影响，虽然这也产生了一些环境问题。秘鲁和中国的贸易关系在过去10年中已经大大增强了，并且已经成为秘鲁最大的贸易伙伴。此外，尽管美国对中国在拉美的影响力感到担忧，但目前看来， 它并未对秘鲁和中国之间的经济合作产生直接的破坏性影响。而且，无论是秘鲁还是美国，都认识到与中国的互动需要采取更为复杂和多元的策略。总的来说，虽然美国在秘鲁有很大的影响力，但这并未对秘鲁与中国的合作产生严重的破坏性影响。反而，秘鲁在迈向现代化的道路上，能够利用来自2个全球大国的资源和机遇，这对秘鲁可持续发展有所助益。
总结来看，秘鲁作为一个发展中国家，面临着许多机遇和挑战。秘鲁拥有丰富的自然资源和独特的地理位置，这为其经济发展提供了优势。然而，秘鲁也面临着经济结构单一、贫富差距、基础设施不足、政治不稳定和环境问题等挑战。秘鲁与中国的合作具有重要意义，尤其是在经济和贸易领域。中国是秘鲁的重要贸易伙伴和投资者，这对秘鲁的经济发展起到了积极的推动作用。然而，这种合作也面临着一些问题，如贸易结构单一、环境问题和社会矛盾等。美国在秘鲁的影响力也是不可忽视的，尤其在经济、政治和援助等领域。然而，目前看来，美国对秘鲁和中国之间的合作并没有产生破坏性影响。最后，秘鲁的发展和崛起需要各方共同努力，包括政府、企业和社会各界。只有通过解决内部问题，提高基础设施建设，改善社会问题，加强国际合作，秘鲁才能实现可持续的发展和崛起。谢谢大家收看六度世界。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是六度 world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。本周三，沪深300指数再次大跌，跌至5年来的最低点，也由此一笔抹去了北京当局连续120小时救市措施所带来的所有涨幅。中国上证指数于上周1月22日跌破关键的2800点心理大关，同一天，沪深300指数也下跌。面对剧烈市场波动，中国在几天内连续召开经济金融领域的新闻发布会，北京动员了大规模国家队救市，并且宣布降低存款准备金率等一系列的救助计划。随后 A 股在券商、保险等板块的强力拉动下开始企稳反弹，而本周三沪深300指数再度下跌 0.9%， 收盘价低于1月22日，令习近平一周来的努力化为乌有。该基准指数在今年1月份已经暴跌 6.3%， 上证综合指数和深圳综合指数则分别下跌了 4.9% 和 13%。主要原因仍然是人们担心北京当局采取的温和措施不足以应对不断恶化的中国经济前景和多年来的房地产危机。本周一，香港法院决定对中国恒大集团进行清算，也加剧了股市的下滑。香港恒生内地房地产指数和中国沪深300的房地产指数在周三分别大跌 2.1% 和 2.5%。境外分析人士表示，投资者对中国的情绪仍然极其悲观，任何由政府推动的小幅反弹都可能会在之后引发更多的抛售。中国的经济大背景似乎也正在恶化。周三的最新数据显示，中国1月份工厂活动再次处于收缩区域，是连续第4个月萎缩。这一信号对投资者来说又是一个打击。中国国家统计局周三在一份声明中表示，本月官方制造业采购经理人指数达到 49.2， 高于12月的读数，但是仍然低于区分扩张和收缩的50点大关。新加坡的新兴市场策略师表示，增长太小了，无法改变人们对前景悲观的看法，还没有出现转折点的信号。仲量联行的经济学家则表示，年初通常是中国农历新年之前的淡季，2月份将迎来为期1周左右的假期，在此期间工厂活动将陷入停滞。但即便如此，总体制造业指标的表现不佳，仍然表明经济存在疲软。 季节性的因素不能够完全解释制造业的低迷。而在制造业读数发布的同一天，周三还有更多的坏消息。中国房地产信息数据显示，1月份中国100大地产开发商的新房销售大幅下滑，销售金额比去年同期下降34%，环比则下降达48%，这是自2020年7月以来销售最差的一个月。随着人们对房地产市场的担忧加剧，路透社报道，中国一个国家支持的房地产项目已经根据新出台的白名单机制，于本周二获得了第一笔银行贷款。同时，苏州和上海也在本周二宣布进一步放松购房限制，以刺激购房者的需求。在1月12号的时候，住房和金融部门曾经下令制定一份有资格获得银行贷款的房地产项目的白名单，而周二该倡议下的第一笔贷款3.3亿元人民币发放给了广西省南宁市的一个地产项目，但是这点资金似乎还是杯水车薪。南宁市向当地金融机构列出的首份白名单中共有107个项目，重庆市则列出了314个白名单项目，所需融资总额达到830亿元。许多分析师预计，房地产市场需要很长时间才能够稳定下来。白名单上的第一批项目包括私人开发商龙湖集团、华宇集团以及国家支持的万科。市场认为这3家房地产公司的财务状况相对良好。与此同时，上海在周二则放宽了购房规定，允许在上海居住5年以上的单身人士可以在外环外购房，此前是只有已婚夫妇才可以购房。广州则在上周也放宽了限购规定。据中国指数研究院的最新数据，目前只有北京、杭州等8个城市以及海南省部分地区仍然维持限购。该机构预计，大型2线城市即将全面取消限购。但是经济学家表示，北京需要做出更加深层次的改变来解决其根本问题。凯投宏观的中国经济主管周三称，目前的刺激措施无法解决经济的结构性问题，复苏基础仍然不稳固，一旦当前政策支持削减，增长就将无法持续。而在房地产和股市双双下跌的情况下，中国投资者和家庭一直在购买黄金。根据世界黄金协会的季度报告，中国是2023年全球黄金珠宝投资的主要亮点。世界黄金协会表示，中国的需求帮助上个月金价创下历史新高，并且在今年将金价保持在每盎司2000美元以上。中国对黄金的投资需求增长了28%，达到280吨，很大程度上抵消了欧洲需求的急剧下降。去年中国的金市消费量则增长了10%，达到630吨。世界黄金协会的高级分析师表示，中国是去年发生的许多事情的关键。由于人们预期中国将会继续面临通货紧缩和收入不确定，黄金敞口已经成为中国投资组合的必需品。世界黄金协会的报告显示，总体而言，去年黄金需求下滑5%，较2022年的强劲需求有所降温。但是，以中国、波兰和新加坡为首的央行购买行动抵消了对黄金投资需求的疲软。分析师表示，黄金正处于一个新时代，它已经打破了与实际利率的相关性，而是受到央行和中国家庭资产配置的推动。而中国作为第一大黄金消费国，它对黄金需求的激增目前没有看到任何减弱的迹象。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
六度大厨为你量身定做美味食谱。登录六度世界，如图点击右上角机器人图标，然后选择六度大厨，就可以开始对话了。
你好，欢迎来到我们的烹饪小游戏，让我们开始吧。你是想做早餐、午餐还是晚餐？
晚餐。
好的，晚餐是一天中最重要的一餐，我们应该好好对待。下面是我的第2个问题，你希望这顿晚餐是素食还是荤食，或者两者都可以？
荤素搭配。
好的，荤素搭配非常健康。下面是我的第3个问题，你对哪种类型的菜肴有特别的喜好吗？例如，你喜欢亚洲菜、意大利菜、法国菜、墨西哥菜或者其他任何类型的菜肴？
喜欢吃日韩风味的。
好的， 日韩风味的菜肴口味独特，非常美味。下面是我的第4个问题，你有没有饮食禁忌或者过敏食物？例如，你不能吃海鲜、牛奶、鸡蛋、坚果等等。
不吃坚果。
好的，我们会避免使用坚果。下面是我的第5个问题，你喜欢辣的食物吗？或者你更喜欢甜的、酸的或者咸的食物？
喜欢甜辣味道的。
好的，甜辣的食物确实很开胃。下面是我的第6个问题，你有没有特别喜欢或者特别讨厌的蔬菜？
不喜欢胡萝卜，喜欢白菜。
好的，我们会避免使用胡萝卜，尽量使用白菜。下面是我的第7个问题，你喜欢吃肉吗？如果喜欢，你更喜欢哪种肉？比如鸡肉、牛肉、猪肉或者羊肉？
牛肉。
好的，牛肉富含蛋白质，是很好的选择。下面是我的第8个问题，你有多少时间来准备这顿晚餐？你需要一个快速简单的菜谱，还是你有更多的时间可以尝试一些更复杂的菜谱？
快速简单，最好微波炉就可以解决。
好的，我会为你找一个简单且快速的菜谱。下面是我的第9个问题，你喜欢用哪种烹饪方法？比如煎、炒、炖、蒸、烤或者微波？
微波炉。
好的，微波炉烹饪快捷方便。下面是我的最后一个问题，你有没有特别想要尝试的食谱或者食材？现在让我根据你的回答为你设计一个菜谱。
主食可以是面食。
根据你的需求，我为你设计了一个简单快捷的日韩风味牛肉面食的微波炉菜谱。菜谱名称：微波炉版甜辣牛肉面。食材原料：牛肉切片200克，方便面1包，白菜100克，韩式辣酱2大勺，糖1小勺，酱油1大勺，蒜末1小勺，青葱适量。步骤：在微波炉安全的碗中加入牛肉切片、韩式辣酱、糖、酱油、蒜末，搅拌均匀。将碗放入微波炉，选择中火，加热2分钟。取出碗，加入切好的白菜，搅拌均匀，再次放入微波炉，选择中火，加热2分钟。取出碗，加入方便面和适量的热水，根据方便面包装上的指示搅拌均匀，确保面被水覆盖。再次将碗放入微波炉，选择中火，加热3分钟。取出碗，撒上切好的青葱，搅拌均匀即可享用。点评：这道微波炉版甜辣牛肉面非常适合忙碌的你，它不仅制作简单快捷，而且口感鲜美，营养均衡。牛肉富含蛋白质和铁质，可以提供你一天所需的能量。白菜富含维生素和膳食纤维，有助于保持健康的消化系统。方便面则为你提供了主食所需的碳水化合物。韩式辣酱和糖的加入，使得这道菜肴既有韩国菜的辣味，又有日本菜的甜味，非常符合你的口味需求。现在，我将为这道菜画一张配图。
Hi, this is Lawan. Welcome again to my show. It's still going on. I guess I'm doing something right. Today I'm going to talk to you about National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's speech at the Council of Foreign Relations. So in his recent appearance at the Council of Foreign Relations event, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan explained the Biden administration's strategic approach to China. He stated that the ongoing intensive diplomacy was successfully working to improve U.S.-China relations from a historic low in the beginning of 2023, when a Chinese spy balloon crossed the U.S. and made headlines. At the same time, Sullivan aimed to show that the current U.S. strategy for China was tough. He referred to the ongoing efforts to strengthen America's partnership in the Indo-Pacific and emphasized the ongoing military and economic partnership of the trilateral relationship between the U.S., Korea, and Japan. So I'm going to give you some of the key points from Sullivan's speech at the CFR event. In this first clip, Sullivan talks about the Chinese perception of America in decline and also talks about the Trump administration's failings to strategically engage with China. Here's the clip.
We also saw something that really stood out, which is that the PRC believed the United States was in terminal decline, that our industrial base had been hollowed out, that our commitment to our allies and partners had been undercut, that the United States was struggling to manage a once-in-a-century pandemic, and that many in Beijing were openly proclaiming that, quote, the East was rising and the West was falling. When we came into office, we inherited an approach from the previous administration that had updated the diagnosis of the scope and nature of the China challenge, but had not adequately developed the strategy and tools to address it. That approach was at times more confrontational than competitive, and too often undervalued the allies and partners critical to sustaining an effective China strategy.
Here, Sullivan's guarded reference to the previous administration's shortcomings in engaging China certainly works as a veiled critique that Trump's hardline stance against China was ineffective. He then went on to challenge the Chinese vision of America as a country in decline, repeatedly stating that the Biden administration, quote, rejects what was a common view that it was a story of inexorable rise on one side and inexorable decline on the other side. He then continued, quote, choices matter in both Beijing and Washington. On Taiwan, Sullivan framed the recent elections as evidence of the success in diplomatic engagement between the US and China. Here's the clip.
Just a few weeks ago, Taiwan held historic elections without any major cross-strait incident, in part because all sides, Washington, Beijing, and Taipei, worked to reduce miscommunication and misperception about their respective intentions. That is an outcome that few may have foreseen in August of 2022, when most expected the cross-strait situation to grow more tense, not less. Well, we were explicit and direct publicly and privately with all stakeholders that we were not taking a position in those elections. We remained studiously neutral throughout. And otherwise, from the United States' perspective, Taiwan exhibiting this vibrant democratic character is a positive thing. And our policy remains constant through it. As it was before, it will be going forward. The One China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances, and all of the issues that people in this room know so well. It was also clear that we continue to have concerns about elevated levels of aggressive military activity around the Strait. We don't regard that as conducive to peace and stability. And we generally want to see, as I think the rest of the world does, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and we are committed to doing everything we can to support that.
Sullivan's statements about American neutrality in the Taiwan elections echo Liu Jianchao, who appeared at a Council on Foreign Relations event the week of the Taiwan elections. Although he was repeatedly pressed on the possibility of William Lai, who China has called a troublemaker and a separatist, winning the election, Liu remained reticent on Lai and instead restated Beijing's orthodox stance for eventual reunification. Perhaps the most illuminating part of the talk was when Sullivan was asked about the U.S. approach to China's presence in Africa. Sullivan spoke of the destructiveness of viewing Africa as a battleground for proxy wars. Here's the clip.
One thing that Kurt and I wrote in our foreign affairs piece in 2019 that I have felt like really important to keep us disciplined in this is that we cannot treat the rest of the world as proxy battlegrounds the way that I think the US and the Soviet Union too often did during the Cold War. So looking at Africa, our question should not be how do we gain relative advantage over China in this country, because that becomes a warping and distorting factor that frankly, in a way, can also undermine our overall position. So the question we pose instead is, how do we offer a better value proposition? And I would say one of the areas that, frankly, is a gap that we are trying to fill now quite actively is mobilization of capital for investment in the things that African countries are looking for their development, in infrastructure, in clean energy, in digital. And that's about money. And it's about public sector money leveraging private sector dollars.
Although Sullivan stresses that the current U.S. strategy is not to, quote, gain relative advantage over China, and rather to, quote, offer a better value proposition, it sounds like the current administration's approach is not to force African countries to, quote, pick a side, but rather to try to compete against China economically. This potentially opens the African continent to be an interesting theater for the competitive relationship between China and America. With the Belt and Road Initiative, China obviously has a strong head start in the race to build infrastructure. The American approach in Africa has historically been one of military collaboration. The U.S. has one permanent naval base in Djibouti that hosts more than 5,000 people. But throughout the continent, America also maintains 26 other military outposts. America's approach has proved problematic in several African countries. For example, in Mali, where America maintains a military outpost, Colonel Assimi Goïta led a coup against former President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in 2021. Goïta received training from the U.S. and France and had experience fighting with U.S. Special Forces. That same year, Mamadi Doumbouya, another military officer that received U.S. training, led a coup in Guinea. In Niger, Brigadier General Musa Barmu, who had received U.S. training, helped lead a coup in 2023. The coup in Niger was just one of what became termed a wave of coups in Central and West Africa, including in Burkina Faso, Gabon, Chad, and Sudan. Last September, I interviewed Professors De Valera Bachwe and Moussa Traoré, who are based in Ghana. Here is a clip of their perspectives on the coups in West Africa.
A lot of the Western media is treating the coups in West Africa as the death of democracy. That's what they're calling it. But it sounds like there wasn't, at least in Burkina Faso, there wasn't very much democracy before, and possibly, paradoxically, after the coup, there's been more democracy now. Is that the case? Do you challenge the idea that the coups are ending democracy in West Africa?
First, I think that we have to understand that the term democracy is not a universal, label. Actually, who defines democracy and who is democracy? So, if a certain part of the world's media is saying that this is the death of democracy, then perhaps they are referring to a particular type of democracy that they want to see, enveloping the whole world. And I think that it's important for us to even look at China, look at Russia, that these two places have been described by some media houses as non-democratic spaces. But when you ask these two countries or geopolitical entities, they will tell you that they are practicing democracy. It is their form of democracy. So democracy must be understood within specific geopolitical and cultural spaces.
Clearly, America is long overdue for a strategy shift in Africa. Perhaps economic competition with China to develop infrastructure projects may prove more fruitful to America and to African countries. Time will tell. In its ongoing efforts for high-level diplomacy with Beijing, the Biden administration faces sort of an impossible task. Its realist approach that aims to maintain a stable but competitive relationship with China has been criticized by conservatives as, quote, one-sided or weak. Republican Congressman from Wisconsin, Mike Gallagher, who currently serves as the chairman of the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, called the Biden administration's strategy, quote, zombie engagement, and criticized it as a, quote, revival of an approach to China that has failed for 30 years. Although Sullivan worked hard to frame the Biden administration's approach to China as a success, it is unclear how popular that approach will be among American voters come November. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is 华尔街前线, and I am Lao Wan.
My aim today is not to try to unveil a new China strategy, but something more straightforward, to share with you behind the curtain how we've tried to implement our strategy over the last 3 years, and then what we might expect here in 2024. And in the course of that, without directly answering the questions Mike has posed, perhaps provide a little grist for the mill that can help over the next couple of days as you grapple with these very difficult questions. I want to start by taking a step back. Before serving in the Biden administration, many of us who are now in government, including myself and Kurt and others, were revisiting the assumptions behind our longstanding China policy in writing and in conferences like this one. And once in government, we immersed ourselves in the latest intelligence, expertise, and analysis. We determined that the PRC was the only state with both the intent to reshape the international order and the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. We saw that the PRC sought to, quote, catch up and surpass the United States in high technology, that it was pursuing the largest peacetime military buildup in history, and that it was more repressive at home and more assertive abroad, including in the South and East China Seas, as well as the Taiwan Strait. We saw the PRC working to make the world more dependent on China while reducing its own dependence on the world. And we saw it taking steps to adapt the international system to accommodate its own system and preferences. We also saw something that really stood out, which is that the PRC believed the United States was in terminal decline, that our industrial base had been hollowed out, that our commitment to our allies and partners had been undercut, that the United States was struggling to manage a once-in-a-century pandemic, and that many in Beijing were openly proclaiming that, quote, the East was rising and the West was falling. When we came into office, we inherited an approach from the previous administration that had updated the diagnosis of the scope and nature of the China challenge, but had not adequately developed the strategy and tools to address it. That approach was at times more confrontational than competitive, and too often undervalued the allies and partners critical to sustaining an effective China strategy. But we did not want to return to an earlier approach with the PRC, one based on more optimistic assumptions about its trajectory, and that sometimes prioritized avoiding friction over pursuing the American national interest. So we developed our own approach, which Secretary Blinken laid out in a speech a couple of years ago, Invest, Align, Compete, that sought to strengthen our competitive position and secure our interests and values while carefully managing this vital relationship. And over the past 3 years, we've implemented that approach. We've made far-reaching investments in the foundation of American strength at home with historic legislation on infrastructure, chips and science, and clean energy, all while addressing the PRC's non-market practices and taking steps to ensure that the United States would lead in the sources of technological and economic growth. We believe our approach has generated results. Large-scale investments in semiconductor and clean energy production in the United States are up 20-fold since 2019. Construction spending on new manufacturing projects has already doubled. And looking out over the next decade, we're estimating $3.5 trillion in new public and private investment unlocked by the investments made in the historic legislation I just referenced. Abroad, we've tried to strengthen our ties with Indo-Pacific allies and partners in ways that would have been unlikely, even inconceivable a few years ago. We launched AUKUS, we elevated the Quad, we upgraded our relationship with Vietnam, the Philippines, India, Indonesia, and others. We launched a historic trilateral with Japan and the Republic of Korea that culminated in a historic summit that President Biden hosted at Camp David. We held summits, multiple summits with the leaders of the Pacific Islands, as well as with ASEAN. Our regional allies and partners, for their part, are betting on American economic vitality. They've announced almost $200 billion of investments into the United States since the start of the administration. We've also worked to connect our European and Indo-Pacific alliances, and together with our G7 partners, we've aligned on collective steps to de-risk our economies and diversify away from strategic dependencies rather than decoupling. And alongside our allies and partners, we've stressed the importance of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We've also worked hard to ensure that advanced and sensitive technologies our companies are developing do not become a source of vulnerability. We implemented carefully tailored export restrictions on key technologies, focused on advanced semiconductor manufacturing tools, a topic, by the way, that was central to one of the earlier UCSD forums, when I first really got immersed in this question of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, supercomputing capabilities, and the most advanced chips critical to military modernization. We also took steps to regulate outbound investments of concern in technology and to strengthen CFIUS's focus on critical technologies to make sure inbound investment actually addresses evolving national security challenges, the screening regime for inbound investment. These steps are not about protectionism, and they're not about holding anybody back. They're critical for our national security over the long run. Now, the backdrop to these actions was the strongest post-pandemic recovery and among the lowest inflation of any leading economy in the world. For years, economists were predicting that the PRC would overtake the United States in GDP, either in this decade or the next. Now those projections are moving further and further out. And with the PRC facing its own set of challenges, some say that moment may never come. And this brings me to a critical point. America, in this moment, is once more showing its capacity for resilience and reinvention. But this is not the whole story. And that's what's really critical about the remarks I want to give today. As we took these steps to improve our competitive position, we aim to do so in a way that built stability into one of the world's most consequential relationships, perhaps the world's most consequential relationship. And in fact, We believe our investments at home and our work to deepen ties with allies and partners abroad actually created the conditions for more effective diplomacy with the PRC. A sustainable China policy is about holding in one's head multiple truths at the same time and working iteratively to reconcile them. We are clear-eyed about the competitive structural dynamics in our relationship with the PRC. But we're also keenly aware that the United States and the PRC are economically interdependent and share interests in addressing transnational problems and reducing the risk of conflict. We realize that efforts, implied or explicit, to shape or change the PRC over several decades did not succeed. We expect that the PRC will be a major player on the world stage for the foreseeable future. That means that even as we compete, we have to find ways to live alongside one another. Competition with the PRC does not have to lead to conflict, confrontation, or a new Cold War. The United States can take steps to advance its interests and values and those of its allies and partners on the one hand, while responsibly managing competition on the other. Being able to do both of those things is at the heart of our approach. And in fact, the United States has decades of experience talking to and even working with our competitors when our interests call for it. Over the last year, we've called on that experience. And while, quote, managing competition can feel like an abstract slogan, the best way to understand how it translates into action is to zoom in on 2023. The year began with the relationship at a historic low point. A year ago this week, a Chinese spy balloon traveled across the United States. We were and remain deeply concerned about the PRC providing Russia with lethal aid in its invasion of Ukraine. And after historic and unprecedented, and not historic in a positive sense, PRC military exercises in August of 2022, it seemed a series of cross-strait crises loomed over the horizon. All of this set back the progress from the Bali summit between President Biden and President Xi. High-level communication halted, to say nothing of military-to-military ties or cooperation on counter-narcotics or climate, all of which the PRC had frozen. We set out to stabilize the relationship without sacrificing our capacity to strengthen our alliances, compete vigorously, and defend our interests. Beginning in May of last year, we launched a period of intensive diplomacy. It was an all-hands-on-deck effort across the cabinet, spanning the full range of our relationship with the PRC. The goal was not to paper over our differences. Our aim instead was to address misperceptions and miscommunication, to avoid major surprises, to reopen defunct channels, and to more clearly signal to each other about our respective positions and interests. And we sought to increase not just the quantity, but the quality of our communication. In May, I spent 2 days with Director Wang Yi in Vienna to help restore some normalcy to the relationship. In Vienna, we reached consensus on a rough roadmap for high-level engagement to carry out the agenda that President Biden and President Xi had set forward in Bali. One, both sides hoped at that time, would ultimately culminate in a leader-level meeting in San Francisco at APEC later in the year. In the months that followed, we held a series of critical meetings. In June, Secretary Blinken traveled to Beijing and met with President Xi and senior foreign policy officials, working to stabilize after a period of tension. In July, Secretary Yellen traveled to Beijing to build relationships with the PRC's new economic leadership. And that same month, Special Envoy for Climate John Kerry traveled to reopen climate channels that had stalled for months. Then in August, Secretary Raimondo visited the PRC to advance our commercial ties and underscore our commitment to protect critical technologies with national security implications without severing the economic relationship between the US and China. Critics said at the time that this travel was one-sided, but our strategy was to use those meetings to open up a two-way flow of exchanges, and that's exactly what happened. This intensive diplomacy was about managing tough issues rather than patching up the relationship. We were direct about our differences, including PRC's support for Russia's war against Ukraine and cross-strait issues. We did not pull back from national security-focused measures like restrictions on outbound investment and updates to our export controls. Instead, we used these meetings as opportunities to explain what these measures were, but almost as importantly, what they were not, which was an attempt to undermine the PRC's prosperity and development. That is not what those measures were, and we explained that clearly to our counterparts in these sessions. We also use these meetings to find space to coordinate on issues where our interest overlapped. In September, Director Wang Yi and I met in Malta for another round of meetings. We charted the course for a leader meeting in San Francisco and laid out what we hope to accomplish on issues like counter-narcotics and mill-mill channels. Over the following weeks, Majority Leader Schumer led a bipartisan delegation to the PRC, and the PRC sent a stream of officials to the United States, including the Vice President, the Vice Premier, and Director Wang Yi, who came for 2 days of meetings with Secretary Blinken and myself. And all of this culminated, as you heard from Mike, in the meeting, the summit between President Biden and President Xi in Woodside, California, which saw progress on 3 major issues. First, President Biden and President Xi restarted counter-narcotics cooperation. Since then, we've seen Beijing take initial steps to stem the flow of precursor chemicals used to make fentanyl, progress that we hope and need to see continue. The first interagency counter-narcotics working group between the U.S. and the PRC met today in Beijing, and our aim is to open up law enforcement cooperation on fighting this terrible drug. Second, President Biden and President Xi announced the resumption of military-to-military communication that had been frozen for more than a year. The chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff has now spoken with his counterpart, and we've restored a number of critical operator-level mechanisms. The question now is whether that will continue even in the face of future turbulence. We, for our part, will continue to make the case that military-to-military communication is critical at all times, but especially in times of tension. And third, the Woodside Summit saw our leaders announce a new dialogue aimed at managing the risks of artificial intelligence, which will start in this spring. As Mike mentioned, this past weekend, I met with Director Wang Yi in Bangkok to follow up on the Woodside Summit and to advance efforts in each of these 3 areas. Detailed, dogged diplomacy is necessary to manage the friction that is endemic to a strategic competition between 2 major powers. Some risks to that effort may be unforeseeable, may be surprises. Other risks are more recognizable, including friction in the South and East China Sea and economic and technology moves and countermoves. The most significant risk would be a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, especially given Beijing's increased military activity in and around its air and waters. Here, too, intensive diplomacy matters. Just a few weeks ago, Taiwan held historic elections without any major cross-strait incident, in part because all sides, Washington, Beijing, and Taipei, worked to reduce miscommunication and misperception about their respective intentions. That is an outcome that few may have foreseen in August of 2022, when most expected the cross-strait situation to grow more tense, not less. But it's no guarantee of future trends, and the risk remains real. So we have to keep working at this by intensifying both diplomacy and deterrence. Over the next year, as we have for the last 3, we'll continue to take action on human rights abuses, forced labor, and non-proliferation. We'll be vigilant about the PRC's support for Russia's war against Ukraine and its efforts to help Russia reconstitute its defense industrial base. And we'll take necessary measures to respond. If PRC provocations continue in the South and East China Seas and the Taiwan Strait, we'll work closely with allies and partners to push back and speak out about the risks to peace and stability in the world's most important waterways. We'll continue to uphold freedom of navigation in the region by flying, sailing, and operating wherever international law allows. And we'll continue to pursue tailored national security measures designed to protect our national security. And even as we do so, we'll aim to continue the pace of intensive interaction with the PRC that has helped both sides manage areas of difference and unlock cooperation on areas where our interests align. We're not planning to recreate the now outdated structures and mechanisms from an earlier period in the bilateral relationship. And we're definitely not interested in dialogue just for dialogue's sake. But we do see value in launching and shepherding a select number of working level consultations in discrete, carefully chosen areas to advance our interests and achieve results. That's the approach we use today on counter-narcotics, an approach rooted in the here and now rather than in the nostalgia of the past. In the period ahead, we hope we can work with the PRC to deepen crisis communication mechanisms to reduce the risk of conflict. We're ready to coordinate on climate, health security, global macroeconomic stability, and new challenges like the risk posed by artificial intelligence. We'll also talk to Beijing about challenging regional and global issues from the Red Sea to the Korean Peninsula. And we'll work to advance progress on a range of bilateral issues too, including people-to-people ties. Let me conclude by noting that none of this will be easy, and there will be times of tension. That's inevitable in a competition like this that is simply not going to resolve in a neat and decisive end state. And as I noted, one thing is certain, there will be surprises along the way. We'll keep working to manage the competition as we have over the last year. We'll continue to invest in our strength at home and to deepen our global networks of alliances and partnerships abroad. The approach I'm describing to you is not some big strategic shift. It's an effort we began building from the day we came into office. It's also not something new to American statecraft, far from it. It's an approach that is itself uniquely American and rooted in decades of history, diplomacy, and hard-won experience. It's also rooted in bipartisanship because when the United States deals in a strategic competition from a position of strong bipartisan support, of all pulling together in service of the country, we always come out stronger for it. So we intend to stick with this strategy. We intend to do what we need to do to protect our interests and defend our allies, while at the same time effectively managing competition with China to the good, not just of the United States, but to the good of global stability as well. That is our commitment. That's what we've tried to do. And today, my goal was simply to walk you through how we've tried to execute that in practice so we can get beyond the kind of broad slogans and down to the actual day-to-day hard work that an incredible team of people across the entire U.S. government, both career and appointed, have been working. And we've done so, I must say, looking around this room with the support and advice of a huge number of people here from both parties, from the private sector and the public sector, and across a range of walks of life. And that is the only way we're going to continue to succeed in this effort as we go forward. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
So Jake, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your remarks. I think we're all much better informed about what you've been building in terms of China policy and the successes that you've had. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask 3 or 4 questions to Jake up here, and then we're going to turn to the audience to take questions from you. This is all on the record, and we will try to end promptly at 7:45. And we'll proceed with the rest of the activities of the evening. Let me begin by asking you if, what, if anything, you would feel comfortable telling us about your recent meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Thailand. Any great breakthroughs to report here tonight? Any news you want to make before the assembled multitude?
Well, first, we had a very nice meal, so that was good. This is my 3rd extended round of conversations with Wang Yi, the first in Vienna, the second in Malta, and then this one in Bangkok. And with each successive round, I think we, having increasingly gotten to the point of setting aside the talking points and really having strategic conversations. In terms of next steps, the main things coming out of the meeting were actually to, kind of fix the launch of this AI dialogue, where the U.S. and China will work together to manage risk, and that will get going this spring. So we talked through what the elements of that would look like. Second, we had the opportunity to go deep on cross-strait issues and to share our respective positions. And I'll be cautious, as you know very well, this is littered with landmines to speak about publicly, and also I want to respect the discretion of the channel. But I think it was a very useful, direct and candid set of conversations on that topic. And then we obviously also had the opportunity to talk about current events in the Red Sea, current events on the Korean Peninsula, concerns that we have about instability in both places. And I would say the quality and character of those conversations and a rather direct and in some ways intensive conversation about the war in Ukraine, I think helped both of us leave feeling that we didn't agree or see eye to eye on everything, but that there was a lot of work to carry forward. Last point I would make, we agreed that President Biden and President Xi should speak and should speak by telephone relatively soon. I think the acknowledgement coming out of Woodside that there really is no substitute for leader-to-leader conversation. It became so apparent over the course of that meeting in Woodside how central that ingredient has to be to an effective stewardship of U.S.-China policy. And so both of us agreed that we would report back to our leaders and we would get them on the phone sooner rather than later.
Great. Let me ask you on the Taiwan question. They've recently, of course, had elections in Taiwan. A lot of commentary by some of the people in this room about the significance of those elections. How do you see them, and what impact do you think the results might have on our ability to manage the cross-strait relations?
Well, we were explicit and direct publicly and privately with all stakeholders that we were not taking a position in those elections. We remained studiously neutral throughout. We congratulated the winner. We congratulated Tsai Ing-wen on an effective democratic election. And now, we've made clear we would like to see a smooth transition. And otherwise, from the United States' perspective, Taiwan exhibiting this vibrant democratic character is a positive thing. And our policy remains constant through it. As it was before, it will be going forward. The One China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances, and all of the issues that people in this room know so well. And President Biden has been clear that we remain committed to the One China policy. And I was clear on that with Wang Yi as well. It was also clear that we continue to have concerns about elevated levels of aggressive military activity around the Strait. We don't regard that as conducive to peace and stability. And we generally want to see, as I think the rest of the world does, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And we are committed to doing everything we can to support that.
Thank you. I want to ask a little bit about the Chinese economy. There's a lot that has been written about the structural problems of the economy, a lot of speculation that the administration in Beijing has neither the ability nor the willingness to address those underlying structural problems. A fairly gloomy view about the prospects for the Chinese economy. And I wonder whether that narrative is too negative. And I'd ask you how you see the prospects of the economy and the ability and willingness of Xi and his team to address some of the structural problems that we all know about in terms of the real estate sector and indebtedness and all the rest.
In the last couple of times I went to the UCSD China Forum, it was before I came into government. I made a habit of going up to the smartest people I know on China and on economics and buttonholing them and saying, tell me about the economy in China. And I would hear a kind of general answer from one, and I would think, okay, that's the answer. And then I would talk to someone else and they would have quite a different answer. And the spectrum of opinion on whether China's economy among incredibly informed, right-thinking people is quite broad. And so I'm humble enough to not really be able to characterize the likely future trajectory of that economy, because I think if you had asked people that question 2 years ago, they might have a different answer than they have today. Frankly, if you asked people about the US economy 1 year ago versus where they are today, people would have a different answer. So what we're focused on fundamentally is thinking about what we can do to invest in the sources of our own strength here in the United States. And I talked about that some in my speech. And we kind of reject what I believe was a kind of common view that somehow it was a story of inexorable rise on the one side and inexorable decline on the other side. Choices matter in both Beijing and Washington. We're trying to make the right choices. And of course, it's up to Beijing how they choose to make choices on their side. How's that for not really answering your question?
It's good. It's good. You know,
I'm learning from Tony Blinken how to be a diplomat.
I'm going to go off script for a minute and ask one question about how you frame the policy, because you make clear that our goal is not to hold back or undermine the Chinese economy. That's not the objective of what we're doing. We're doing things to protect our own national security interests. But don't we have to be candid with China that some of the things we are doing to protect our own national security interests are actually having an adverse, and will have an adverse effect on the Chinese economy? They'll have an adverse effect on our economy in terms of economic growth and the like. Have we been candid enough with the Chinese about what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, and what impact it's going to have on China?
I mean, one thing that we really tried to embark on, and I alluded to this in my speech a year ago, was to be much more direct and transparent about what the nature of the measures we were undertaking both were and would be, because we were telegraphing to them as well. This is where we are going on outbound investment or on updates to semiconductor export controls. This is why we're doing it. This is how we've tailored it. This is the rigorous process we put in place, and this is the rationale. And then heard their response to that. And Wang Yi and I had an opportunity in Bangkok to talk about how each of us, China and the United States, see the boundary between economics and national security. And obviously, we don't have completely converging perspectives on that question. But I think it's really important to recognize that for a very long time, the PRC has taken measures on explicit grounds of national security that have had an adverse impact on American workers, American businesses, the American economy. And so this cannot be a one-way street of a conversation. You know, China will come to the table with its concerns about what the United States is doing, and the United States has an obligation on behalf of its citizens to come to the table with our concerns about what China has been doing for quite a long time. And I certainly came to the table prepared to do that when we were in Bangkok.
For you. I'm going to give you one more chance to make some news. Should we, on this issue of technology in particular, should we expect further steps by the Biden administration to de-risk the U.S. economy from its overdependence on China? And in what areas are we like to see further action?
So first, to answer your question, I probably won't make news. I just want to take a minute on what we mean by de-risking. And in fact, I've said this directly to my Chinese counterparts. It basically has three elements. First, investing in America's industrial and innovation capacity. A big way to de-risk is to have more capacity ourselves to be able to, operate at the technological innovation edge. The second is to diversify supply chains so that we're not dependent on any single point of failure. And that's not all about China. That's a lesson we learned from COVID, but the PRC is a part of that. And the third is to have a series of tailored measures so that American technology cannot be used to undermine the security of the United States and our allies. And in this category, we have been transparent that we've taken a series of steps already. And we will take further steps as we go forward, all according to the basic principle that we are going to tailor them and target them in a way that they really are aimed at our national security concerns and not at a broader effort to decouple our technological ecosystems or our economies. But I will leave for a later day what exactly the nature and timetable of additional measures will be. One more thing I will say is, in October of 2022, we did a first round of export controls on advanced semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. In October of 2023, we updated them. I think the world can expect that will be part of the process going forward, because as the technology evolves, our controls have to evolve. It doesn't mean the standards underlying our controls evolve, those remain constant, but they have to be applied to technology as it advances, and that will require updates to existing controls, even as we add, targeted, tailored controls in other areas as well.
If I were a man from Mars coming down, I would say, listening to you and observing the relationship, that these two countries are trying to maintain some stability in the relationship and have made some tactical shifts. But strategically, China is continuing with a series of policies they've been pursuing for some time. And the Biden administration is going to continue, as you just suggested, with the policies done. There seem to be a lot of centripetal forces pulling at this relationship, and that's before you get to the United States Congress. Can you really keep it kludged together? What's the way to keep it kludged together?
Look, it's a fair question, and obviously we've gone through periods of considerable tension even during President Biden's tenure, but he is determined to hold these two things in his head at the same time. As I said before, that yes, there are structural competitive dynamics in the relationship, and we should be clear-eyed about that, and we should look at that, stare at that square in the face. And on the other hand, we have an obligation for our own national interest to ensure that that competition does not veer into conflict, that we manage it to a point of stability, and that we also find areas where we can work together where our interests align. Now, that recipe is, I think, relatively easily distilled in words. It is harder to put into action, and it requires a level of intense diplomacy of the kind I really tried to walk through in my speech, and care, basically constant gardening. And even then, whether foreseen or unforeseen, risks and tensions could boil over. You cannot deny that, but it is, we don't have to be fatalistic about it either. Our job is to try to understand in a clear-eyed way what those risks and inherent tensions are, and do our very best to manage them without compromising on our fundamental values and without walking away from the defense of the American national interest and the interest of our allies and partners. And part of the reason that I try to give these remarks in more of a way of like, let's actually just talk about 2023 and what we did through the year, is there's a lot of aphorisms in the U.S.-China relationship: manage competition and, invest, align, compete. At the end of the day, it really comes down to a set of actions that we take here domestically, a set of investments we make in our allies and partners, and then just direct, dogged diplomacy with China, built on the proposition that, yes, we're going to compete, but we also are going to inhabit the same planet. And we have to work together to ensure that we don't end up tipping over into conflict. That's what this is about. It doesn't really reduce to a bumper sticker, but I think it's a kind of common sense strategy that can secure bipartisan support, and that people, if you kind of look at American attitudes on the PRC, I think that's basically where the American people are. They want us to be tough and stand up for our interests and push back against aggression or actions that harm Americans, but they also are not looking for war. And so that's what we're trying to work towards.
Last quick question for me. We have a session tomorrow on the China Forum about internal political situation in China, both its resilience and its fragility in its political system. Anything you want to say about that in terms of how you feel?
I'll refer you to Beijing to comment on it.
So we'll all have to tune into the session tomorrow. I think
Exactly.
Jake is deferring to that. Let's go to the audience if we can. I want to remind everybody this is an on-the-record session, and I'd like to invite folks from the audience to engage in this conversation. So please raise your hand, and I will call on you. Let's start with this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Rotenberg. I'm with the Center for AI and Digital Policy. And you talked about artificial intelligence in your remarks. I wanted to begin by saying I think it was very good that China participated in the UK AI Summit. That was not originally anticipated, but clearly, as you've said, it's important to maintain discussion about the risk of AI and warfare. But at the same time, there are also clearly two different forms of government. And AI can support an open and pluralist government, or AI can support a more closed, constrained form of government. And it seems to me that there is a policy debate playing out right now regarding the governance of AI, and frankly, some concerns about the US position. So presently at the Council of Europe, a treaty on AI is being negotiated. The mandate of the Council of Europe is to promote fundamental rights, democratic institutions, and the rule of law. And many of our democratic allies are looking for a robust treaty that safeguards fundamental rights in this era of AI. Concerns have been expressed about the US position, and my question is, will the US government support a robust treaty on AI that safeguards fundamental rights?
So we have been very actively engaged in the negotiations over the treaty at the Council of Europe because our basic vision for the governance of AI is rooted in the idea of the protection of fundamental rights and the empowerment of people, lifting them up rather than holding them down. And we do have a very different vision of AI governments than the PRC does, which is why our dialogue with them will really vector in on our kind of responsibility as significant countries and major AI players to manage the risks of AI as we go forward. And we've put forward voluntary standards that we've gotten some of the biggest AI players in the world to sign up to. We've issued an executive order that reflects many of the core values and principles that are at the heart of your question. Where things ultimately land on the treaty in the Council of Europe is not going to be whether the US is for or against a treaty that is strong on fundamental rights. It'll be on more specific provisions that may cut across particular interests we have. So I can't predict how that treaty negotiation will turn out, but I can tell you that however it turns out, it will the United States' basic commitment to this broader vision, which we have articulated ourselves and have now begun infusing in international institutions, including an effort at the UN General Assembly to have a resolution on AI. That work will be active and the United States will play a leadership role in it.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Wafaa Ben Hassin. I'm at the Omidyar Network. I'm also a UC San Diego alum, political science. So thank you to the CFR for bringing San Diego to us, even if you couldn't be there. My question actually takes us to a different geography. In Africa, we see China moving beyond the Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road. We see them have relatively nuanced interventions in how they attempt to influence policy, such as by way of example, supplying Huawei phones to all sorts of nonprofits and independent media groups and outlets. I'm curious if you could illuminate a little bit about the US's positioning in Africa and how we would potentially like to secure our national security and also promote human rights in Africa in response to these types of interventions. Thank you.
So first, my sister is actually a UCSD alum as well. She went to UCSD Medical School. So I got to hang out there with her. It's a beautiful campus, wonderful place to go to school. One thing that Kurt and I wrote in our foreign affairs piece in 2019 that I have felt like really important to keep us disciplined in this is that we cannot treat the rest of the world as proxy battlegrounds, the way that I think the US and the Soviet Union too often did during the Cold War. So looking at Africa, our question should not be, how do we gain relative advantage over China in this country? Because that becomes a warping and distorting factor that, frankly, in a way, can also undermine our overall position. So the question we pose instead is, how do we offer a better value proposition? And I would say one of the areas that, frankly, is a gap that we are trying to fill now quite actively is mobilization of capital for investment in the things that African countries are looking for their development, in infrastructure, in clean energy, in digital. And that's about money. And it's about public sector money leveraging private sector dollars by buying down political risk, currency risk. And we have worked very closely with the new head of the World Bank, who President Biden played an active role in helping get into the job, Ajay Banga. We're trying to expand the World Bank's capacity to do this. We've worked with the G7 through PGI, the Project on Global Infrastructure and Investment, to do this. And we're increasingly looking to work on a bipartisan basis with the Congress to try to have the resources necessary to unlock these kinds of investments. Because you can't beat something with nothing. China is coming with a substantial amount of capital and also, as you said, other tools to be able to bring to bear. And for the United States, our view should not be, you know, in any given country, you know, what's just the way we get a one-up. It should be, how do we actually show up and offer something that will respond to the legitimate development needs of that country? And I think I would grade us as incomplete on this. It's work that we have begun to do quite actively in this administration, and we have a lot more work to do. That's going to require Congress working with us to unlock some of these resources that in turn can unlock a much larger share of resources from the private sector to deliver the value proposition we want to deliver.
Dan Rosen.
Dan can talk about the Chinese economy.
But people have heard enough of me talking about it, Jake. So that's where I want to circle back to. So you come to the conference and one economist thinks one thing, another, but isn't that true of political scientists and security experts out here too, that you're going to have a whole spectrum? And to wage a systemic competition, don't you have to come down to a sort of point of view about how their economic system is doing in order to figure out how well we're performing in that competition? And while there's probably diversity here in the audience, I hope within USG, you guys managed to come to a net assessment about how that Chinese economic system is performing.
So first, you've just completely exploded my artful dodge of Steve's question. So I appreciate that. Second, in fact, Dan, as Dan knows, we brought in a group of experts who have immersed themselves in the Chinese economy to the White House. Maybe it was a year ago or so. And there was a diversity of opinions among that group, you know, with quite sharp disagreements. First, I would say there is a bit of a difference. I don't find the diversity of opinion on just basic underlying strategic diagnosis. There's a lot of debate about what we should do about it on the political and security side. Less spectrum on kind of what are we dealing with, what are we looking at. There are some. Secondly, yes, we do need to have an operating assumption. But I think the point I'd like to make is that operating assumption has to be humble, because it has to be adaptable to the reality of what we see as new economic data comes out, or as various trends that we've all been watching manifest themselves. So we are operating according to a certain set of assumptions. I will now, for the second time, try and dodge laying out exactly what they are, because I just don't see a huge amount of upside in the U.S. National Security Advisor kind of holding forth as an armchair analyst on China's economy. But I would say that we also need a multi-directional strategy that can apply if our assumptions turn out to be wrong. And I would also say that this has been a uniquely difficult time to be quite precise on this because of COVID-19, the pandemic, how all the pieces fit into place. But broadly speaking, what I said in my remarks and what I said in answer to Steve's question, I would just reinforce, which is we came into office not accepting what I think was a kind of broad-based conventional wisdom about relative trajectories of the US and the PRC. The president didn't accept that. I didn't accept that. Our team did not. And we continue to push back against this idea about inexorable rise, terminal decline as being a central characteristic of the relationship. And I guess I should stop talking now because otherwise I'll get myself into trouble. So that's what I'll do.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Hey, Jake. Kim Dozier, CNN analyst and CFR member. I wanted to ask what your message was regarding China's continuing support for U.S. adversaries, specifically Russia, including Beijing, helping Moscow avoid some of the technology sanctions and providing, while not weapons, but basic equipment like heavy-duty trucks for Russia's war on Ukraine, and China's support for Iran with rising petroleum purchases, whereas you've recently blamed Iran for supporting the deadly attacks that cost the lives of U.S. troops this past weekend. Thanks.
So as I referred to in my speech, The war in Ukraine has been a through line of my conversations with my Chinese counterparts, going back to before Wang Yi with Yang Zhiche in the early months, where we sent a clear message about our concern that China might provide lethal aid for use against civilians in Ukraine. We have not seen the provision of lethal aid, but as I said in my remarks, and as you noted in your question, we have seen support from Chinese companies to help Russia reconstitute its defense industrial base. And we have been clear and direct about our concerns. And I noted in my remarks that as we watch this happen, we're prepared to take steps to respond to that kind of activity, because we believe that Russia's defense industrial base is basically building up to continue to support an imperial war of conquest in Europe. And that's a fundamental national security interest of the United States. And I made no bones about that in my conversation with my counterpart. The president has recently signed an executive order that gives him additional tools and authorities to deal with this challenge. It's not directed at the PRC. It is general to countries that are supporting Russia's defense industrial base, but it gives us tools in this regard. With respect to Iran, one of the areas of substantial focus in the discussion was about the continuing Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and the disruption of a vital artery of maritime commerce, undermining of supply chain security in the global economy, and frankly, disruption to China-Europe trade, which the Red Sea is obviously critical to, and made the case that China, as a responsible player, as a UN Security Council member, has an obligation to use the influence it has in Tehran, to get those in Tehran to use the influence they have with the Houthis, to push back against this kind of behavior. And I won't, characterize the response, because I'll leave that to Wang Yi to do for himself, but I will just say that was a detailed and substantive conversation, because it is a matter where we believe that countries, particularly permanent members of the UN Security Council, have unique responsibilities and should step up to those responsibilities.
I'll take one or two more questions. This gentleman here, and then this woman back there. Sir.
Thank you, Jake. Art Collins with the group. Talk to us a little bit about the trilateral relationship with South Korea and Japan. As we know, you mentioned it earlier, the Prime Minister of Japan will be here in the spring for a state visit. Japan is obviously increasing, in fact, maybe doubling its military budget, but what else do we expect from our partners in that regard in both South Korea and Japan, and what are we prepared to do beyond what we've already done with that critical relationship?
Well, first, I think it's important to recognize that the security dimension of that trilateral relationship is critical. It has been a source of propulsion for pulling the three countries together. And it manifests in closer intelligence coordination, closer defense cooperation, exercises, joint deterrence, particularly when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. And we'd like to see that continue to evolve. But I would also point out that the trilateral partnership expands well beyond that. First, it expands beyond the region. If you look at support for Ukraine, Japan and Korea have both stepped up in significant ways to stand with a fellow democracy in Europe. And the Japanese Prime Minister has been particularly articulate in explaining that what happens in Ukraine matters in the Indo-Pacific. And President Yoon has reinforced that. And then finally, the relationship extends to economic coercion, the intersection of technology and national security, innovation, economic investment, and vitality, all areas where the three countries have a huge amount of complementary capacity to support and lift one another up. When you put all that together, that is a formidable partnership of three countries with shared values, huge capacities across economics, technology, national security, and global reach. And so, we're very proud of the work that we've done so far, but it is very much a work in progress and has to be built on from strength to strength as we go forward. I was just recently in Seoul for a trilateral meeting of national security advisors to convert this into the details of how we work together on things like early warning for missile defense. And also to think about areas where we can work together, for example, to answer the question that was posed earlier. How do we collectively have a value proposition in the developing world with 3 large ODA budgets from our 3 countries? So, that trilateral partnership is not about any country. It's not about China. It's not about North Korea. It's about being for something, a vision for the world, for the region, but for the world writ large. And we feel that it has helped create a huge amount of momentum behind shared priorities, and we want to continue to develop that.
Last question, and I apologize to those who I did not get to. Ma'am, back here. Right here. Yes. Can you pass her the mic? Thank you so much.
Hi, Maggie Doherty with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You briefly mentioned human rights, so I would like to hear your strategy towards Chinese abuse of human rights, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christian minorities. How are we going to face that challenge?
So first, the president, as he has said publicly, has been very clear and direct in his conversations in the 2 summits that he's had about the kind of fundamental responsibility and obligation of an American president to speak out on these issues because it's core to who we are. That's not about trying to weaponize the issue. It's about living out our values. And that's the ethos that he has tried to inculcate across the U.S. government as we deal with this issue. And so that means not just that we speak out on these issues, but that we take actions. And we have taken a series of actions over the course of the past 3 years in each of the areas you mentioned. And to a considerable extent, we have done that in partnership with the Congress on a bipartisan basis, including laws that have been passed under our administration that we are now implementing on issues like forced labor, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. So this is something that will remain a critical priority and feature of the U.S.-China relationship as it has through multiple administrations. And from our perspective, having direct diplomacy and intensive management of the relationship is not inconsistent with standing up for, speaking out on, and taking material action on issues related to the protection of human rights.
So we're here at the end of our time. Let me tell you where we're going to proceed from here, if I can. I want to thank you all for joining this hybrid meeting. Jake, thank you for being with us. I want to note that video and transcript of today's meeting will be posted on the CFR's website. I want to thank CFR and the China Forum for organizing this event. Now, for those of you who are here in Washington, not attending virtually, the China Forum will now hold a brief memorial and tribute to Jeffrey Bader. So please, those who want to attend that, please remain in your seat to stay for this tribute. Otherwise, you feel free to go into the next room and have some dinner and drinks. But for those who want to participate and attend the Jeffrey Bader tribute, please stay here. I just want to say a final word. I would say that no national security advisor has ever faced the kind of challenging international environment that you face every day. And we all know what it is, all its various components, but it's really an overwhelming challenge. And I can't think of anybody I would rather have in the National Security Advisor job to deal with that problem. And I think you've shown tonight how uniquely capable you are in dealing with that. So I want to thank you for what you do every day to advance the interests, principles, and values of our country in facing these huge challenges. And thank you for being with us tonight.
万事不辞，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。 您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后，可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。